you have a stack of 5,000 resumes. Is each one going to get looked at? Well, by a human, perhaps that would be impossible, but by an AI, not necessarily so. So at least that gives you hope that there's some sort of screening that can happen on everything that's sent in.
Welcome to Draup Dialogues, an exclusive podcast series of industry leaders sharing their views on workforce planning, people analytics, and the future of talent intelligence. Today, we're talking to Mariya Meshcheryakova, people analytics leader at Equitable. Mariya, thanks for joining us. Maybe you could give our listeners a little more information about yourself before we kick off the Q&A.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So I have been doing people analytics, specifically statistical people analytics at Equitable for the past 6 years. I come from an organizational behavior background, and I'm deeply passionate about the field. It's a field that has, over the course of my career, probably got started really in it in 2013, really evolved and grown dramatically, and so has talent intelligence. And it's been an exciting journey to see the evolution and see new technologies emerging, honestly, on a almost daily basis these days.
I agree. I've been in the space for about 5 years now, and it's just the changes have been immense. So first, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about location strategy and how you think about that. So, in an era of remote and hybrid work, how do you determine the location strategy to fulfill some of those difficult roles?
It can be very challenging to figure out where a role should be based. And it really comes down to first having that conversation with the hiring manager and figuring out whether that's a role where physical presence matters. So, on one hand, imagine something like an event planner. You have to physically be where the events are. You can't be remote. On the other hand, we have very different roles, like tech roles, where you have a software developer, most of whose meetings are with folks who aren't even in the country, much less that same office. So even if you were to get them in an office, between the time they're spending on solitary work and the time they're spending in meetings with people abroad, there really is no real value they're gaining from being present in the office. And so that's the number one consideration. And then the second thing you really have to think about is the talent where your offices are. So for certain roles, the talent may just not be at those same locations. There are niche roles. There's certain areas that are great for certain sectors but terrible for others. And while your organization may be well positioned in that for the majority of your roles, you are in a great location, for some roles, there may literally be no talent, or the talent might be so expensive because, just like you, the other organizations in your field also have a little bit of need for the role, but just enough to fight over the very small amount of talent in that area. And so sometimes you will find that you could suddenly end up that you're paying New York City salaries in the middle of nowhere, because as it happens, where you are, there's only so many people with that skill set. Just to
The
get
availability,
people hired.
yeah. And the growth, I think also, are you going to be able to sustain that too? So,
Oh,
so, um,
absolutely.
so how can people analytics help their organization discover and acquire those core and niche skills in non-traditional locations, really? So to help them gain a competitive edge.
Yeah. So, you know, one because if you're trying to do kind of a first blush look, you often be realize that okay, we should just hire in these very very gigantic major cities because the talent availability of just about everything is higher in like a New York City or in the Bay Area. And but you will also find your budget falling. You will be vastly over budget if you try to do that. So this is where kind of some deeper analytics comes into play, and you can make and you can look into a specific role and where availability for that role is. So you may find, for example, a smaller part of the country where that niche role has there's a lot of talent availability for it because historically there may have been a company that did training programs. There might be universities that have programs that teach that specific thing. And so you may find places where there's a lot of talent availability, the cost is relatively reasonable, and you can hire. Oh, or alternatively, sometimes what we find is that it makes sense to train. You might find, hey, if I want it here and I want this skill set, you know what, maybe I want to be the company that starts that training program and develop that talent. Um, and that may financially make a lot of sense, but this is where that talent intelligence comes in. What are the relative costs? How much more will it cost me to hire, or how much more will it cost me to train? Because both can be prohibitively expensive depending on exactly the niche we're talking about. And this is where talent intelligence really gives you an edge.
Yep, determining whether you're going to buy or build, borrow that talent. It's definitely. I agree. We talk about that a ton now with the large companies that I meet with every day. So, what do you think are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing in location analytics, and how do you think that's going to change and sort of reshape workforce planning in the next 2 to 3 years?
So I think that the sophistication of what we're able to do with this sort of analytics is really changing, because the problem is not that there is data. The problem is, how do you get that data in a usable form? How do you actually become able to turn it into a valuable insight? Because there's a flood of data coming in from all sources, and traditionally the problem has been that it's so hard to transform. It's so hard to get into a usable form that by the time you get anything out of it, it's already outdated. So this is one of the things that I'm seeing, is that now there's a lot more technological advancement that's allowing that speed to decision making to really increase, and that makes the data more relevant and useful. Certainly, as we see these AI technologies coming into play, that ability to more broadly search, more broadly summarize, that's very helpful as well. That's really speeding that process up, because a lot of it really does come down to how fast can we get from raw data to an actionable recommendation, and is it still going to be relevant by the time we get to it?
Absolutely. And we've talked about, location strategy and thinking about that, but then there's also the piece of competitive intelligence and understanding your peers. So how do you think that organizations can use competitive intelligence and with their analytics functions, right, to close the gap in order to impact those business outcomes?
So this is actually something that is, I would say, an underrated benefit of talent intelligence. Um, a company doesn't just change its strategic direction and take no action, right? If a company is massively changing its strategic direction, it is hiring people to support that change. So when you see somebody hiring a certain type of professional, for example, professionals that are in a niche that is just emerging, you know a lot about which way their strategy is headed. So, yes, they may be years away from announcing this new product. However, if they've hired the talent, then when that announcement is coming several years down the line, you're not just finding out that your competitor is outpacing you. You are already aware that they were going to be doing this. And there's, and you know, and that also is important because it helps you differentiate between what I call media trends and real market trends. So often you'll see in the media something suddenly get traction. A good example a few years back was the metaverse. Everybody was very excited about the metaverse. Uh, but for if you were looking at the talent intelligence landscape, you could possibly see whether the hiring was in just a few organizations or whether it was widespread throughout the market, and whether it did seem like a lot of companies were working on it or a few, and just how much devotion they were giving to it. Because if you hire one or two roles, that's very different from hiring 30 or 40. So that really gives you an idea of the scale of a trend as well. And that sort of intelligence can really give you a competitive edge and help you anticipate future changes in your competitor's strategic directions.
Yep. And I think, so we were just talking about benchmarking and gap analysis against those competitors and looking at those skills. And I guess I'm wondering also, how does knowing those skills and that compensation data help improve internal talent mobility as well, and retention strategies also?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's really, you know, I was once told by someone that you are paid in two ways in an organization. You're paid with your compensation, and you're paid with lines on your resume. So when you want to retain talent, it is important that you have two things. One is that your compensation is not so out of line. And, everybody knows that a person that stays in an organization for a long time typically underperforms one who moves around. But at the same time, happy people are rarely keen to change their jobs tomorrow. And that's true to an extent. If you suddenly start seeing that you're massively undercompensated to the market, then suddenly you're willing to move, and that can be really problematic for an organization, because as somebody works for you for a long time, they only become more valuable. They gain institutional knowledge, and if they've kept up with that skill growth, they're just they're better than anything you can hire in the market at a certain point. So losing that talent to a different organization because you didn't keep up with comp is really, really unfortunate. Similarly, though, and this comes back to what I just said, that they've kept up with skill growth. Now, you don't want your workforce to be falling out of line with the market in terms of skills. So when you think about your learning and development strategies, you really want to be looking at, well, what are the skill sets that are in the market, and does our workforce have those skill sets, and should we be actively developing certain skills? Because let's be real, most people learn most of their skills on the job, and there's no reason why you can't develop a lot of your skills. And modern tools make it so much easier than it used to be. You don't know, no longer do you really have to, for most skills, send somebody off to a graduate degree program. You can just offer them online courses, in-house workshops. There's so many opportunities of both in person and virtual to help them develop those skills. And that keeps your workforce up to date.
Yep. And that keeps people from being sort of stagnant and getting bored in their jobs, right? Like, I feel like
Right.
A lot of times moving, it used to be you'd move around in the organization. Now we have a lot more opportunity to just upskill, right? Because the skills are changing so fast. So, well, interesting. So, as far as AI and automation, when we think about that and like the growing concerns around AI ethics and bias, do you have best practices that you recommend that organizations really kind of adopt to ensure that there's fairness in AI talent intelligence, AI driven?
Yes. The number one most important thing is that AI is never used without human oversight. I Now I am a person who gets very excited about new technology. So I am normally the pusher and driver of adopting technology. However, while AI has advanced incredibly in the last few years, there's huge limitations. You should One thing you want to always make sure is that you're not copy pasting AI content or letting AI make decisions for humans, because these models, they are limited. They have biases based on the data they were trained on. They are imperfect. For example, let's say, I've heard of AI assisted job descriptions. Great, but you can't not have a human recruiter looking at this job description, a manager looking at it. Honestly, the AI's tone might be odd and inappropriate for your organization's culture. You might have that they you might it might be wordy. There might be so many things that you should never have an AI acting on its own. And even more dangerously in the recruiting sphere, where in the initial phases of recruiting, where you are having AI screen candidates. Well, you want to one thing you need to do is you need to analyze for adverse impact. um, Adverse impact is not just for humans and making sure that they do a good job of screening candidates. It's also for AIs, and making sure that the AI is not getting obsessed with certain wording structures and now suddenly deciding that candidates of a certain race or gender are somehow worse in its eyes, because that would be a true disaster. But I think, unfortunately, we do sometimes see in the eagerness to adopt new technology, people get a little inattentive about this sort of thing and create a lot of risks for an organization. Also, I think you really want, when you're using AI, to make steps as auditable as possible. So you do want to, for example, always know why. For example, it's not just AI made a recommendation, it's why did AI make the recommendation? What justification is it using for that recommendation? And similarly, if you can break a task into steps that are more easily auditable, you should. So if you for example, we're having an AI categorize employee comments, you'd want to make sure that you'd want to make sure that the AI first categorize them into categories, and then you could review what it categorized, and then you would want it summarizing. You wouldn't want to do that all at once, because you want to create as much of a you want to create as much confidence in the result as possible. But at the end of the day, AI is always going to be to some extent inaccurate, which is why a human is so essential to the process. Uh, yeah, but yeah, there's a lot that goes into this.
Totally. I totally agree with that. And, I think it's also a challenge when you think about integrating that data then with your systems that you already have. And how do you do that if you're bringing in talent intelligence here and you've got a ton of other systems? A lot of the clients that I speak to are moving to an environment where, they're collecting data in like a repository somewhere, and then they're developing AI agents on top of it, which is what I hear a lot as well. But if the data on the back end is not good, that's where the trouble tends to lie. But How do you think about that and how to manage that data piece?
You know, I almost want to challenge the question here because it's often the problem. Yes, the data integrations are very, very complicated, and it is hard bringing data sources together. And there is obviously often in talent intelligence a good data warehouse, a good source, a unified source of data is the number one most important thing. But I would say that your biggest challenge with integrating talent intelligence, talent strategy is really in the cultural aspect of things, meaning that most people, most managers, due to years of expertise, decades often of expertise, like to use their gut in making decisions. And that's natural. That is how we make all our decisions in real life. So it's not surprising that that's the go-to for business decisions, and our gut is not useless, so that's not necessarily always a terrible way to make decisions. However, with talent intelligence, and when we're talking about these massive amounts of data, your gut is not going to be good enough. And this is where it's all about building a data culture and a trust that data is helpful to your decisions, that it does help you reach a better outcome, and working on that aspect of the change. And I think this comes out of helping leaders solve problems, because as data continuously helps them solve problems, maybe small ones in the beginning, then larger ones as we move along, um, or rather, not I'd say not so much small and large, but less and more complex would probably be the general progression. That helps them build that confidence and learn to realize that they need talent intelligence, frankly, to address a certain challenge, where now they get in the spirit of, oh, okay, I'm thinking about where to base this role, and instead of just going with what I've heard from the people around me, I am gonna have that research done, and I'm gonna make sure that we benchmark that appropriately, because I know that last time we did that, that probably ended up saving us like 27% on that role. And so this time I'm going to make sure I do that, because now we're hiring even more people and now it matters even more.
Absolutely. And when you think about emerging AI capabilities, so how do you think that's going to impact workforce planning, talent acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big change that's going on is agentic AI, is the idea that an AI agent can be acting for you as an organization. And that's huge because they can act as first pass recruiters. So they can be reaching out to candidates, they can be scanning resumes, they can be going through those basic screening questions. Certainly, anybody who's ever done recruiting has had the experience of calling up candidates and asking basically about your minimum requirements. AI could help you do a lot of that, like a lot of that task, which amounts to a recruiter basically writing down an employee's answers to the basic bare minimum questions. This is where AI can really improve the number of candidates you can realistically screen, um, and can really help you avoid certain pitfalls that have traditionally affected recruiting. Like, you have a stack of 5,000 resumes. Is each one going to get looked at? Well, by a human, perhaps that would be impossible, but by an AI, not necessarily so. So at least that gives you hope that there's some sort of screening that can happen on everything that's sent in. And I think but I think a lot of the change will really be in what jobs look like. I think there's very few jobs that are not going to be affected by AI, and I think often people are thinking about jobs being replaced by AI. that I think that is relatively a fraction. Most jobs, I think, are just going to be influenced by AI, where AI is going to change how you do the job. Where, yes, for example, there might be tasks that you can absolutely do as a qualified professional, but as it happens, if you do the task, it takes you 3 hours. If you do it with AI assisting you, it takes you now 30 minutes. That's a 2.5 hour savings. That's increased productivity. Not because you couldn't do it without AI, but because AI just helped your speed to execution increase so much. And I think that's where we'll really see a lot of the benefits of AI coming in and boosting that speed to execution.
You mentioned the interviewing, and I actually have a friend who was interviewing at my age. I'm middle aged, so and it's I wonder what the difference is going to be with how different generations sort of accept that. Like my friend was very upset that she was going to have a virtual interview with an AI agent for a job. And she's fairly high up in marketing and has been for in illegal companies before, but she was like very put off by it, and it'll be interesting to see like if the older generation too is able to adopt that better. You know, I mean, and we're all going to have to, right? But anyway, I digress,
Yeah.
but I thought that was kind of interesting. So,
No, I agree. It is interesting. And I think an important thing to also be aware of is not, I think there's often a tendency to assume that like older folks are slower to adopt these technologies than younger ones, but really it is very individualistic at the end of the day. And honestly, sometimes I find that that the business area they're in can influence that even more than their age group.
yep,
Because
that's true.
let's say you are a person who works in tech or data science or something like that, you adopt new technologies on an annual basis anyway, right?
That's true.
So for you, yet another new technology is nothing. On the other hand, if you're in a business area that has changed very little even in the last 20 years, that then even if you're relatively young, it can be very shocking and jarring to see AI changing something like that and to see that becoming part of your daily life. So yes, so yeah, I do think that there's a generational component, but I also think there's just certain types of people who are just going to be more likely to adopt it easily, and some folks will struggle a lot more. And I think, and also I think a part that will play a role is how comfortable you are with technology as a whole, because some of us that are very much in the tech space are very comfortable, but then you have a lot of folks that frankly are somewhat scared of new technology, that are intimidated by it, and so that's going to play a big role as well.
You're right. You make a great point, and I definitely think that the function that you're in definitely has something to do with that. So I agree. Um, well, let's see. So we've got our rapid fire here, rapid fire section where I'm gonna ask you a question or make a statement. You tell me first thoughts that come to mind with that. So,
Okay.
one emerging skill for folks in HR analytics, what would you say?
Honestly, I'd have to say probably using generative AI, because certainly as a code assistant, um, and it's not. I mean, let's be real. Like we can write code all day long, and we do, but sometimes it does speed up. It does speed up a process. Like for example, like I've used this as a debugging tool before, where I wrote something and I'm like, I have an apostrophe somewhere or something like that. That's wrong. And sometimes an AI can help you find that a lot faster than staring at code and trying to figure out where exactly did you put that darned apostrophe that you weren't supposed to.
So true. Okay, hybrid, remote, or on site. What would it be if you had to choose one for building a high performing team?
Yeah, I would say in most situations, probably hybrid, just because it is in many ways the best of both worlds. When you're looking at remote, there can be losses in team cohesion. There could be losses in work culture. I mean, I will say, like, you can absolutely, with many businesses, have people be fully remote and it'd be just fine. Similarly, on site you have a lot of those benefits of those casual interactions, but you also lose a lot of your diverse talent because now suddenly it's just harder to hire somebody that has family obligations, and honestly, some jobs do not require, most jobs I will say do not require being present 5 days a week. Well, especially in the corporate space. That's my own bias, that I've mostly worked in this kind of environment where you don't see quite the full benefit of that everyday presence. So hybrid often gives you a nice balance. It helps you recruit the most talent while still giving you the benefits of in-person presence.
Also expands your, I guess, your radius for where you can hire people if they're only coming in, yeah, a couple days too.
Yeah, very
Okay,
important in
next
cities like
one.
Atlanta and Charlotte, where there's a lot of
Yeah.
sprawl. People are very
Mhm.
spread out. People are not always
Yep.
willing to commute an hour and a half driving 5 days a week.
Yep. Yep. Okay, the most underrated KPI for workforce planning.
You know, I'd say talent availability, because there's. I'll say it like this: just because you want there to be talent in a certain area doesn't mean that talent exists, and that's often what it comes down to. You can't, even if I pay more money, if the talent is not there, they're just not there.
True. Okay, a leadership principle that has guided your career decisions.
Mm. I would say I the phrase is, don't judge a fish by how well it can ride a bicycle. And it's about it, when you think about people, you really want to be thinking about the unique contribution that person brings and how you can best leverage it. You don't want to put people in a box because you have a certain expectation. With every person I meet, I like to identify what I admire about them. And I can even people like even in I will say, even people in my life that I've disliked, I could tell you probably a list of things I admired about them. And I think that's important because when you interact with people, it helps you get the best of them and the best of their expertise, because you see them for their best characteristics.
That's great. That was a good way to put that. I liked that. Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you today, Mariya. So, wanted to thank you for your time, and everyone stay tuned to Drop Dialogues for more such content from industry leaders on what's trending and how to stay ahead of the curve.